You wrote, "Poetry will be made by everyone, and there will be emus in the zone." Who remembers all that? That ambiguous poetry of the last century. Mankind has come to terms with the coexistence of different concepts of time. The question is simply, why wait? Poetry is made by everyone, and nothing escapes the zone. The real question is, how to reclaim the zone. You wrote from Africa. You wrote from USSR. You contrasted the suburbs of Tokyo to the rooftops of Paris. You sought happiness in pictures. And if not, at least you found the cats. I'm writing you, not from a distant land, a land of darkness or childhood, but a place beyond time. Somewhere between Cat Cemetery of Gotokuji and Mausoleum on Red Square. Your tomb at Montparnasse. More of a dead end than a road to follow. However, accepting that with each year, death takes a filmmaker as if they were a panda. Here I am, to confront the partition, to stare through it with curiosity and admiration, to give a life where 9 have expired, to log in where you logged off, performing the rite that would repair the web of time where it had been broken 10 years prior. In 1957, you wrote, "Korea greeted us with morning calm. 60 years and 100 kilometers south. It seems she has changed her custom. As morning breaks, the fate of President Park Geun-hye is sealed. Exposed in an extortion scandal, which claimed her impeachment and culminated in her arrest. The answer of the street, a torrent of emotion.
노력하고 있었습니다. 여성분이 이렇게 외쳤습니다. 나는 여성이고 동성애자인데 무엇으로 내 인권을 반으로 나눌 수 있다고 생각하느냐. 항의자들의 입을 가로막았습니다.
들어볼 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 리카르도 반대 힘찬 함성 시작!
From the north, you brought back your reportage, Coréenne. In the south, it becomes my guidebook and lens. I find dioramas from photographs and exhibits of your memory. I reconstruct what I can. But when you wrote "The border is the war," the split must have seemed at least somewhat linear. As I confront a new border in this sibling rivalry, there is a coup on the lawn of City Hall, where hands that emerged from colonialism to build a miracle on the Han River have come to reclaim their spot, a spot of fertile soil where the torch of Korean resistance was lit in 1919 and rekindled in 1987. Today, however, as aging militants, with youthful exuberance and American flags, attempt to smother the radiant candlelight of the future, I get the distinct impression the torch has already been passed. As daughter of South Korea's most authoritarian leader, Park's disgrace prompts a difficult question. Beyond the belligerent Hanoi, now swallowed in the spring ether, where those present are forced to reconsider their spot, I find fragility and a gesture that will haunt me. They tell me, Korea's at a crossroads. It is a travesty. Pak has been wrongfully arrested. Every day I pray for martial law. It is the only option. They are a manifestation of Satan. Across the crowded Hwanghamun, however, beneath the bronze turtle ship and stone silhouette of Korean sovereignty, these Satanists seem far more preoccupied with saving lives than taking them. As tireless hands thread ribbon to elevate 476 dead from 3 years of neglect into the most poignant ammunition against Pak's regime. It's not difficult to see who's winning. There is even a joke going around. Pak lived with her father for 18 years, then in exile for 18 years, in government for 18 years. Now will she be in prison for 18 years? When you were 18, you published your first work, a student newspaper. 19, your country was outraged, shattered and martyred. 20, you left for Switzerland. The youngest member of the French resistance might be a bit of a stretch, but it's not my place to rewrite history. You were assimilated into the American army. One cat says as a paratrooper, another as an interrogator. These formative years set a precedent of secrecy and rediscovery that would define and perhaps scar you, as your 67 post-war years would in turn be consumed by the inexplicable relationship between image and memory. Impossible memory, insane memory. Between the pages of Esprit, you were rechristened Chris Marker. You claimed a spot amongst the Parisian literary left wing. Then, in Helsinki, you would mobilize once again. You wrote, "The idea of Greece has been used to fuel the spirit of totalitarianism." Your first encounter with this imaginary Greece seems a fitting start to an elusive story, one that plays with totalities like a cat with string or toy fish. 16 years from Berlin, 28 till Moscow. The tyranny of Helsinki would be bad weather and poor attendance. In your first assignment, Olympia 52, equipped with the ideals of peuple et culture. Leni Riefenstahl's man machines are definitively decommissioned and disassembled for a renewed humanism to ascend the rostrum. You wrote, "There we were, like the apes at the beginning of Kubrick's 2001. The doors of the future had begun to swing open. The remnants of war were collapsing, and your generation, who could be defined by saying, 'I knew Berlin before the war,' or 'I knew Brando thin,' for a few years could pocket another legend. I saw Stalin in the mausoleum." With one paw excavating the past, the other deciphering the future, what Tarkovsky described as sculpting in time, for you must be considered sculpting beyond time. And assuming your identity, one learns to time travel, to emancipate image from memory, to fool about with it, in a way to become unsentimental by finding its utility. Is this what you meant when you said Dziga Vertov was your teacher? Between student, militant, vagabond, and archivist, this antiquated idea of history as eternal magnetic tape, forever rereading itself, is ever present. As your memory would be constantly rescanned and archived, from paper to film to tape to hard drive, snagging on each Madeleine. What is a Madeleine? This is a Madeleine, and this is a Madeleine, and with each Madeleine, a rediscovery. Thus, one comes to call Madeleines all those objects, all those instants that can serve as triggers for the strange mechanism of memory. In your multimedia memoir, In Memory, you lay out your Madeleines like ornaments on a mantle. From Jules Verne to Uncle Anton, your Madonnas and favourite creatures. It's all there, pinned down and decorated in pixelated formaldehyde. But now that I think about it, why? What started all this? Your vigilante-like crusade against the injustice of forgetting. You wrote that the only coherent part of your work was to give the power of speech to people who don't have it, to those fading stars who appear in every film, from Helsinki to Dubai. And so, marked by images of childhood, with cat-like reflexes and a taste for Madeleines, you overcame the tyranny of memory by pulling icons from the delirium and placed in other images the purity of those indelible moments granted as a child. With all this talk of Madeleines, on this journey through memory, what Proust was to Hitchcock, and Hitchcock was to you, now you are to me. You wrote, "In my imagination, I could still see an illustration from a book I had looked at in my childhood, without knowing exactly what it referred to. It was, in fact, a scene at the gates of Peking. Wherever I go, I seem to spend all my time chasing those immobile stone faces. Asian peasants, African Marxists, even European bourgeois. I went to the monument on Namsan Mountain, commemorating the first demonstration against the Japanese, to which both sides of the crowded city centre owe their entire existence. I'm not sure why exactly, but staring at the Taegukie this afternoon, a strange feeling came over me. I thought of your illustration, realizing that I myself had been dreaming of Korea, ever since the World Cup in 2002, when, as a child, this strange flag seemed to belong more to that funny world of Picasso than my own. The royal red and blue, distorted beyond recognition, evoked something inexplicably exotic. It's not very often that one can step into a picture belonging to one's childhood, yet there I was. And in that moment, with a purity that had been dormant for 15 years, it seemed Earth had doubled in size once again. What is a Madeleine? This is a Madeleine. That evening, I found my own character taking revenge on society. As if from out of those stone faces, I had retrieved a Dokkaebi, a mischievous spirit in hanbok, which inadvertently I have now seemed to unleash upon the city. Predictably, it's up to him to play us out and proclaim of this first day in Seoul the words, the end. Since childhood, a fascination for museums. You gave each one their sovereignty, exploring as if it were the city itself, unburdened by time, like a game save. In Tbilisi, you could respawn each morning to greet Mr. Noah in a moment of solitude. I find myself, however, wandering in Ouvroir. Your remodeling of the Eidetic island from the invention of Morel into an archipelago of second life. A cyber sanctuary, part Hyrule Castle, part Palats Kulturi, whereby you can relax, you can dance, and even play cowboy. When you are done with that, there's a screening room, a sitting room, and of course, a roller coaster. Just swap out Valencia and Tifa 2 for equally passé polygons. Then you too become a kind of ephemeral fugitive, deciphering a presence stuck between planes. In Statues Also Die, your first real film, you wrote, "When we disappear, our objects will be confined to the place where we send black things to the museum." And so here we are. Beyond first and second life, as treasures which had never left your studio on Rue Courat are shown on the top floor of the Cinémathèque Française, you too become a contemporary of those mute idols and black things recovered from history. Under the sign of Chumu, I am reminded of a passage in Letter from Siberia. You wrote, "In these graves, which rest on foundations of ice, life and death are separated by nothing more substantial than a breath of air, as if that same breath had been included in the price of admission. Your trinkets seem on standby. Just bring back the body, and your studio could boot again." I suppose it's true. What remains of dinosaurs like you belong in museums. My real fascination, however, is the fragility beyond the collection, the tentative narrative that turns objects into artifacts, whilst itself remaining uncertain. In Seoul's state-of-the-art Pak Chung-hee Presidential Library, these insecurities play out with a formidable irony, as ultimately the attempt to recalibrate history inadvertently underlines the conflict of the city centre. The spectre of autocracy that has plagued Korean democracy for over a century. Committed to those values imposed on impressionable imperial army officers, Park Chung-hee held power across 18 years and 2 constitutional republics, solidifying the miracle on the Han River with the most militarized and repressive regime since Japanese occupation. But perhaps his defining moment came whilst speaking at the National Theatre. When a botched assassination killed his wife, somehow undeterred, with a composure exemplary of those samurai he had admired as a child, Park resumed the address, simply gathering her possessions upon exit. 5 years later, he too would be dead. Assassinated by his own intelligence service, but afforded the first state funeral since Korea's last emperor. By 1959, you had compared this broken peninsula to a tale of 2 orphans. By 1979, it seems one orphan had made a commitment to another. At Seoul's National Cemetery, I discover the Korean concept of Han, a state of grief pertaining to a kind of vengeful resentment, where 40 years ago, Park Eun-hye bid farewell to her parents, releasing a fog of nostalgia that would consume Seoul until today. More than just an exercise in democracy, Park's impeachment symbolizes an emphatic end to her father's legacy, one that has defined 2 orphans for nearly half a century. At the Odussan Unification Observatory, I glimpse that which you had sufficed to name sweetness. As inquisitive siblings marvel at the mystery of their motherland, this simple gesture, made in the viewfinder of a telescope, chips away at the last vestige of the famous crisis of ideologies, transforming a fortress into a pasture, to unearth the profound harmony interned in these ancient waters since the famous tale of Shim-chung. Your parting gift would be the last in a unique series which had begun with Petite Planète. Neither history or guidebook, propaganda or travelogue, but the equivalent of a conversation. Teasing text against image, from Ireland to Israel, in a new kind of adventure for kids to share with their cats. All the while, you travelled like Plume, disarming coincidences and discovering signs. In China, you stepped into a picture once belonging to your childhood, played Malraux against Stalin, Van Gogh against Mao, and discovered a festival of colour unique to Beijing. You wrote, "My first film, not one of my best, but if there's one thing I wouldn't cut out of it today, it's the memory of that bedazzlement." This portrait of yesterday's China, now closer to Humphrey Bogart than the China of 2000 AD, in truth may not have been your first film, but was truly your first great home movie. Your first masterpiece, however, lay at the edge of the world, between the earth and moon, between humiliation and happiness. Its name was Letter from Siberia. Beneath the surface of that hostile land, you unearthed not only a new type of filmmaking, but a lens to fit a new kind of sensibility. That which André Bazin called horizontal, then became Marquesque to 1,000 others, but to me is better illustrated by a game of cat's cradle, forged between ear and eye, where soldiers' bed to fish in a dish becomes romanticism plus electrification. After that, it's straight ahead. As I walk along my own grove of birch trees, native to my own Devil's Island, I can't help but play the game. I picture your mammoths and monsters, those deserted culture parks and Ushatik the bear, even your 10% of conformity, because no worthwhile film about the Soviet Union could be without bribery. Sputnik, Laika, and the slow pan of Angarsk Central Square. As crisp arches and towering steeples thaw the Stone Age forest into the radiant future, for a moment you forget where you are. Just take away the tiger, and you're in Minsk. More of a refrigerator than tundra. However, as heroes of labor join those of the Yakutsk Opera in returning to folklore, this neoclassical larder is an interesting footnote to your world of picturesque denizen and cooperative Servane. Whereas Siberia is perhaps best known for its exiles, Minsk is considerably less, although there is one Hall of Famer. In 1959, failing an ill-conceived affection, the unconscious body of Lee Harvey Oswald was found bleeding out in a hotel bathtub. Incredibly, his recklessness paid off. The 20-year-old Marine from Louisiana, who would eventually kill John F. Kennedy, was allowed to stay, receiving a new flat in the new hero city of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Upon hearing the news, he asked, "Minsk? Is that Siberia?" You wrote, "The season of dying water is winter. The ghost of the winter hare is snow." Letter from Siberia is a testament to the unique freedom of filmmaking, but by framing reportage against animation, poetry against advertisement. Perhaps your first masterpiece says more about post-war Paris than provincial Russia. In 1946, Leon Blum arrived in Washington to sign the Bloom-Burns Agreement, giving Hollywood unprecedented access to French theatres, once limited, then banned under occupation. This renewed artistic freedom amidst the dominant but sensitive cultural narrative of de Gaulle's résistentialisme. Pressed upon the first decade of post-war cinema, certain parameters for rediscovery. But as your compatriots on the other side of the Seine were seduced by Humphrey Bogart and Orson Welles, you lugged around Henri Michaud and Gérard de Nerval, all looking to commit to celluloid, that French ideal which would change cinema forever. Tarkovsky had his dogs, Medvedkin his piebald horses. You had cats and owls. Good for you. All you see are the girls. You wrote, "The stolen moment of a woman's face tells something of time itself. Beyond all else, at eye level, at arm's length, at zoom's length, the close-up of a woman's face became your defining motif, casting from each stolen moment a statuesque gaze, as if it were the shorthand of those legends written beyond time. You wrote, it's the instinct of hunting without the desire to kill. It's the hunt of angels. And with each angel, a gaze. The French gaze. The Japanese gaze. The Slavic gaze. The Yugoslavic gaze. Then there is the gaze of billboards, of screens. The gaze that looks back. The gaze that doesn't. It's noon in Cairo, in Tel Aviv and Tallinn. Midnight in Honolulu, morning in Harlem. Lunch is late in Leningrad, but early in Lisbon. It's beautiful in Beijing, but bedtime in Brisbane. Your first trip around the world, and already you might have been the Eisenstein of essay film. Then, in the most beautiful city in the world, as the first spring of peacetime met the outbreak of World War III, you came home to face your fellow countrymen. Trading in your textbooks for the talk of the town, which stocks had risen, which had tanked. Then again, how much did Algérie Française have left in the tank? And what about Fantomas? You wrote, I was completely immersed in the reality of Paris 1962 and the euphoric discovery of direct cinema. Then, on the cruise day off, I photographed a story I didn't completely understand. I'm not sure why exactly, but at the top of Yerevan's Cascades, I am reminded of that particular Sunday afternoon. I recall the image of a frozen sun, a woman's face, and a man running. A roar, a gesture, a crumpling body, and the cries of a crowd blurred by fear. My mind wanders beyond the moment of a man's death. I picture the violent scene spill into a violent sequence with pounding jackboots of panting GIGN, a ricochet through the terminal hall, announcements, evacuations, the rush of pompiers, paramedics and the press, until finally the man from the camp is detained. But for how long? Your best-known and most influential film was a defining moment for the new wave, as if it were a metaphor for the whole generation whose individual and collective memory were not entirely in sync. Those who could no longer reconcile the principles of the past against the anchor of the present. And so, in 400 photographs and 8 seconds of film, you leapt fearlessly into the future, like a jump cut. It's remarkable that your only foray into fiction could leave such a legacy. the man continues to manifest in film schools all over the world, to the Golden Globes, even the Billboard Top 10. You might have been forgiven for spending a career telling sci-fi stories with still images. However, I suppose the morale of La Jetée is to look back, but never go back, and you never did. So what about that woman's face? In Paris, a museum filled with ageless animals, remains filled with fragments of your timeless film. Like a museum to those days of happiness. The face of happiness, however, is another one. But where does it come from, that face? Well, Simone Genevoix as Joan of Arc. You wrote, "This is the image that taught a child of 7 how a face filling the screen was suddenly the most precious thing in the world. In a word, the image that taught you what is love." From Paris to Pyongyang, the Pentagon to Praia, as cinema and women became two inseparable notions, you made it your life's work to reframe and rediscover that moment you had been granted as a child. You wrote, "You track, aim, fire, and click. Instead of a dead man, you make him eternal." All this talk of hunting leaves me foxed. It's tough to rediscover the poignance in your pictures, but even tougher to pull the trigger, as my dead eye hinges on an insecure criteria. I want them to see me, but not too much. Not enough as to appear unnatural, just enough to consent. If they don't see me, however, snap what is needed and take nothing more. You wrote the number of times people said thanks, knowing they wouldn't get the picture. I think between your century and mine, the perception of amateur photographer has collected certain connotations, be it through paparazzi or perversion. Did you know, for example, it's impossible to mute the camera on phones sold in the Asian market? I didn't. Not until I took a photo with some Koreans, upon which the silencer coded in my selfie caused quite a stir. In Helsinki, you leapt onto the silver screen, but in the golden October of Tokyo 64, as the world rediscovered Japan, the new Japan of transistors and bowing emperors, you fell in love with a city full of tiny legends. You wrote, "Here, time is a river that flows only at night. Inventing Japan is just another way of getting to know it." I couldn't make it to last year's Sakoku Games, so naturally I must fill in the blanks. I recall that summer in Tokyo, where I developed a sudden obsession with baseball. Well, with the spectators on game day, because as you know, the real action takes place in the stands, and the real athletes are the beer girls. They run, jump, climb, stoic as soldiers while dressed like cheerleaders, lugging overpriced beer from the best seat in the house all the way to the nosebleeds. But as Kon Ishikawa, in his official film, cemented the games as a symbol of human aspiration, you forfeit personal Olympic glory to place a new name into the gallery of star fairies.
Test. Name Geronimo, and I'm from Las Vegas. Lulu.
Movement. What was the movement like?
Small and black,
Right.
and with a terrible voice, and she was speaking all the time. She was found in a trash bin, and she had some issues with her nose and eye, and yeah, her voice was, I cannot describe it. It was terrible. I think I really love Lulu, but I think we all were fond of Ludovic. He was very, very, almost a person. Very, very tiny. He had one missing eye. And it was very nice.
In the Kumiko mystery, you balance the spirit of New Japan against a face from Old Japan. Part Anna Karina, part Kim Novak, but absolutely Japanese. The Japanese gaze, when cornered by a funny face, is strikingly raw. From Kagoshima to Hiroshima, even now one cannot entirely negate the weight of history. As if that burden wasn't enough, then there's the male gaze. A burden which Yukio Mishima mounted against a temple, looking like some beautiful ship crossing the sea of time. He wrote, "They are weary of an existence that involves constantly being observed. They feel hemmed in. They return the gaze by means of that very existence itself. The one who really looks is the one who wins." How does one really look? In Sunless, you contrasted a bar in Namidabashi to a market stall in Bissau. Places which supposedly allowed you to stare with equality, safe from hot-blooded barbers or timid Tangmu. You saw them, they saw you. Well, they saw your camera. When the magical function of the eye meets that magical extension of the eye, a reciprocal gaze breaches the partition between witness and participant. This method, your method, of sewing moments into an eternity far beyond the length of a film frame, places an unmistakable divinity into an unassuming crowd, evoking the candor of those pre-modern faces found in museums and monasteries. It might suffice to say, the gaze that really looks is that which keeps looking. When all the girls have gone home, then there are your critters and favorite creatures. Seemingly inconsequential, but animal innocence is not just a trick for getting around censorship. It's a bait and switch. As your clawed co-stars stretch into frame, they too stare with equality, bringing down man to the level of the beasts, beyond exploitation. I think the key to unlocking your Kino eye lies in that freedom of which you frame subjects. Men, women, and children, statues, landscapes, dogs and cats, wholeheartedly and indiscriminately, side by side, the gaze of the living and the dead. At Tokyo's National Art Center, I met another dog, another cat, and another gaze. Giacometti's. To copy a few lines from the catalogue, I suddenly came to the realization that the gaze is the only thing that is always alive. The rest of the head became to me little different from the skull it will be after death. What really makes the difference between the dead and the living is the gaze. Make no bones about it. With no budget for illusions, your lens never modified. When a cat was a cat was a cat. A missing cat was a lost cat. A cat hit by a car was a dead cat. And a fat cat was a plant killer. You were defenseless in your lack of affectation, making the tragedy of a dead giraffe as irreconcilable as that of a dead gorilla. A death is a death is a death. As if it were the jetty at Orly and the moment of one's termination. When the gaze is extinguished and death stares back, it becomes perversely impossible to look away. In Sunless, you quoted those few definitive and incommunicable sentences spoken by Brando in Apocalypse Now. Horror has a face and a name. You must make a friend of horror. Maybe that's why you, an animaniac, could make peace with bullfighting. You wrote, Spanish bullfights challenge death. You stare at the sun, stare death in the face, like in the fascist anthem, Cara al Sol. In Death in the Afternoon, Hemingway confessed that for men like you, marked by war, the only place where you could see life and death, violent death, now that the wars were over, was in the bullring. I'm lucky. I only vaguely remember hearing stories about violent death. Bombs in faraway places like Beirut or Belgrade. Or when taking preservatives into school, puzzled as to where they were going. Maybe it was Ethiopia, but I can't be sure. To me, violent death was basically just something in Hollywood and history books. Until the moment I discovered the word terrorism. In the playground, from a teacher, on that overcast, late summer afternoon in 2001. Perhaps you too can consider yourself lucky. You died in time, before having to relive those scenes from your youth. As once more, Paris was outraged, shattered, martyred.
I don't know if it's very interesting, but this feeling connected with murder, It's brutal, it's unfair, it's blind, it's violent, and it's very strange, yeah, because historically Paris was always a very rousing, violent city. But I think the post-war people see Paris as something like with people outside, nobody seems to be very worried or nobody even seems to work. So it's very pleasant and relaxing place and very associated to peace and I don't know, sweet life. And for me the most unbearable thing was to imagine dead people on some terrace. And the second one was to still not know how many people would be killed because it was increasing, so it felt completely unstable and dangerous on these very nights. It was like living just a couple of hours of war, and also calling your friends and hear and the voices that they are not safe, that they are scared, that they are hiding, and the little humiliation that comes with that they are, hunted. The day after, like on the French social media, we also on the news, like I discovered things like I'm very naive, but it's been a long time that there weren't any war inside France. Because when we say wounded or injured people, it's actually wounded and injured with machine guns. And so the work the doctors were describing, it was totally like a war. And also what they discovered when they could enter inside the Bataclan concert room was, of course, terrible. And at the end, it was a lot of killed. It never been so many dead people in the streets of Paris since the Second World War. So it was, yeah, it felt like there was like the TV was very stupid because, of course, there was a lot of racism and so it felt very depressing because like the country was cut in half. So yeah, so it felt like a giant funeral atmosphere.
My summer in Tokyo, 53 after yours, and 4 stops on the Chuosobu line. From the Yokozuna of Gyogoku to the baby faces of Korakuen Hall, the talk of the town was, can the cleaner dethrone the rainmaker? Wrestling tames violence into an art. It's athletic, dramatic, dangerous, and ridiculous. And not unlike the bullfight, a dance. The difference, however, is the climax, where, as the gaze of death is inseparable from the bullring, it has no place on the mat. These warriors don't kill, they don't even really fight. They make a composition in violence, like a sculptor, like Giacometti, to make a friend of horror. But there's more than one way to skin a cat, and so the girls don't stay home for long. You wrote that because love is truly the only victor over time, women maintain a particular relation with death. In both that film you saw 19 times, Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, and its remake, so-called, a woman's face has the capacity to resurrect a love that is dead, overcoming the violence imposed by time. You wrote, to cast out the horror that has a name and a face, you must give it another name and another face. In Sunless, the monsters were laid out for Natsume Masako, playing the part of the monk in Journey to the West. You wrote, for the first time in history, the platonic dream of pure beauty united with pure wisdom was realized. Little did you know that platonic dream would resurface 18 years later in your little corner of Paris. It all began on a summer night in 1987 with a muse at a banquet saying things clever people already know and morons will never know. Somewhere between Natsume Masako and Tatiana Samoylova. But of all the gestures and gazes caught in a lifetime of leader, Catherine Belcoja was the most glamorous. Illuminating a film, a TV show, 3 shorts and an installation. Part star, part muse, part magician's assistant, Catherine Belcoja was for you a kind of cinematic cat burglar, slipping into the past as if it were a window ajar, relaying secrets and retrieving signs. Beginning with the installation Silent Movie. Together you could rewind and overwrite those monochromatic icons of the pre-talkies to cast a perennial beauty across the first century of cinema. Far from the mission San Juan Bautista or Orly Airport, horror movies came to life on Okinawa. Projecting onto that lizard-shaped tranquil paradise the sobering reality of spring 1945. The Blade Runner, with whom you decipher such barbarism, is the cyberpunk Lorelei, Laura. Hoping to simulate an alternative outcome to the historical tragedy, Laura attempts to complete her late husband's last work, a video game reconstruction of the Battle of Okinawa. Inevitably, she fails, but as the somewhat recognizable suffering of a grieving widow becomes a link to contextualize the incomprehensible suffering of mass suicide, the totality of violent death is made perceptible again in the gesture of a woman's face. You wrote, "Must one die to get to level 5? In 1986, Saint Joan the Maid was restored and screened at the Palais de Chaillot. You wrote, "A loop of time was looped that evening, when I found myself sitting not far from a charming old lady who didn't suspect for 1 minute she had been literally my first love." In level 5, that loop of time had looped once more, as a woman going loopy addressed you, the editing wunderkind. From Petite Planète to primetime in the camps, tirelessly you'd been looking to rediscover that image from your childhood. Then, suddenly, there it was, surrounded by glitching monitors and trophies unlocked, as if you had switched seats with Simone Janvois. The image of love and absolute beauty had finally stared back. In Odessa, that unique monument which for a while stood at the top of the steps, has been moved away from the tourists to a dead street. You wrote, "The image of heroes doesn't come from life, however transfigured, but straight out of a movie, and not only Eisenstein's." In a grin without a cat, you frame the encore of the New Left against the dress rehearsal of the Potemkin, setting in motion the demonstrations of the 60s with a word spread all over the screen: Bratya, brothers. Before her impeachment, Park Geun-hye agreed to the installation of US missile defense system, THAAD. Perceived by many Koreans as a provocation against the North, further undermining the prospect of peace on the peninsula. With Park behind bars, it was now time for round 2.
시민 사드 배치 현주 국민들이 평화롭게 참외 농사 짓던 그곳에 사드라는 무시무시한 미사일이 들어오고 있습니다.
감옥으로 내보낸 국민들입니다. 우리 국민들이 다시 힘모아 이 전쟁 위기 상태를 평화의 상태로 되돌려.
Amidst the thundering of Gwanghwamun Plaza, complete with catchy theme songs and eye-catching choreography, Moon Jae-in steps into frame. A son of northern refugees, imprisoned as a student for demonstrating against the dictatorship, Moon is the symbol of that new Korea, emancipated from the burden of the military junta. You wrote, "Why sometimes do images begin to tremble?" Well, a large camera doesn't help, neither does a crowd. From direct cinema to direct to DVD, I picture your last demos. As you rediscovered those ancestral slogans from Eisenstein movies, in the millennial war paint of Paris 2002, how lovely. It occurs to me, however, that with the critter pointing you in the right direction, even into your 80s, you made room for the odd Kaineko. And so, as I find myself out of luck and in search of signs, I remember your fascist killing machine of choice from that year in Paris and swap cameras to tempt the cat from under the sofa.
누가 든든한 후보입니까? 누가 국정을 안정적으로 이끌 수 있겠습니까? 국민 여러분께 보고드립니다. 저 문재인 대통령 준비 끝냈습니다. 네, 저도 당당하게 국민만 믿고 가겠습니다. 저들은 저 문재인만 바라보지 마. 저는 국민과 민생만을 바라보고 앞으로 가겠습니다. 감사합니다. 감사합니다. 반드시 승리하겠습니다. 문재인, 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 문재인.
I expected at least a paw, but no. The cat is nowhere to be seen. I didn't know it at the time, but Moon didn't need luck. 1 month later, it was a landslide. In Armenia, it's almost the same story. After a turbulent decade, fraught with police brutality, electoral fraud and corruption allegations, Serge Sargsyan, the conservative pro-Russian president, was running once again as a ruling party candidate, following a controversial constitutional reform, which, by shifting Armenia from presidential to parliamentary republic, allowed the president to remain head of state as prime minister. Not bad. On the other side of the aisle is the camo-clad Nikol Pashinyan, a journalist and human rights activist, first imprisoned in 1998 for defamation against Interior Minister Serge Sargsyan, then in 2010 for protests against President-elect Serge Sargsyan. This blatant and shameless censorship ultimately solidified Nikol as Armenia's leading political opponent, declaring upon release, "Our fight is unpreventable, our victory inevitable." It seems now he was unstoppable. Declaring a general strike, Nikol calls for nationwide protest and civil disobedience, blockading all roads, railways and airports to take a step and reject Sargsyan and the spectre of autocracy, which too has haunted modern Armenia for over a century. After almost a month, the two meet. "I am very glad you accepted my numerous calls for dialogue," says the president. "I think there is a misunderstanding," responds Nikol. "I came here to discuss the conditions of your resignation. That's why I ask you not to use the term dialogue." "This is blackmail," declares the president. "You do not understand the situation," insists Nikol. "Power has been transferred to the people." The president, not wishing to pursue his dialogue any further, leaves, implying that the party of Mr. Pashinyan has no right to talk in the name of the nation. An hour later, as riot police attempt to put down the protest, Nikol is detained. The president's triumph, however, is short-lived. The army sides with the protesters, and Sargsyan is forced to resign. The night before the final vote, the movement reconvenes.
Հիմա քանի որ այս պահին շատ երկար եք սպասել, որևէ ձգձգում չի լինի, խոսքը տրամադրում ենք Մեշացի Էլի Սերժ Թանկյանին։ Ինչ է տեղի ունենալու եւ երբ որ աշտարակում Զվարթնոց Երևան ընկած ճանապարհին նույնը կրկնվեց եւ Սերժ Սարգսյանը Վաղը 12:00-ին ազգային ժողովում սկսվելու է վարչապետի ընտրությունը եւ հանրապետական խմբակցության մի շարք պատգամավորներ Սա Արցախի հանրապետության Հայաստանի հանրապետության աստեղային ժամն է եւ մենք հավաքվում ենք ժամը 11-ից հանրապետության հրապարակում հայ ժողովրդի Հայաստանի քաղաքացու Արցախի հանրապետության Սփյուռքի եւ Հայաստանի հանրապետության դարակազմիկ հաղթանակը տոնելու եւ նշելու եւ ուրեմն կեցե ազատությունը կեցե Հայաստանի հանրապետությունը կեցե մենք եւ մեր երեխաները որ ապրում ենք ազատ եւ երջանիկ Հայաստանում Հայաստան 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 Հայաստան
In all the excitement and anticipation, for one slightly hallucinatory moment, I had the impression you appeared. Look what the cat dragged in, I thought to myself. Not exactly a doppelganger, but not a half-bad stuntman either. The next morning, the vote is cast. Nicol becomes Prime Minister, and the Reject Surge movement takes its victory lap. Or is it a dance? In Besançon in eastern France, just before Christmas 1967, you discovered in the workers' strike at Rodiaseta factory your own Potemkin. The elephant in the room when it comes to Slon, however, is the tendency of proletarian art to smother poetry with realism. It's admirable, of course, but by trading personal ambition for collective aspiration, ironically, your Marxist films are perhaps your least revolutionary. To me, what is truly liberating is the multidisciplinary slap in the face of public taste 150 million will call Markeresque. As you recode and defrag, the filthy slime and hieroglyphics of academia into the slang of the suburbs. You mapped a DIY directory for rediscovery and made the unreadable compatible. All that remains, in the words of Henri Michaud, is to tear down the Sorbonne and put marker in its place. And while we're at it, why not pixelate the walls of the Surykovka and command Z the Royal College of Art? In A Grin Without a Cat, what began with the Potemkin sailors ended with the Prague martyrs. As any hope of socialism with a human face was disfigured by the Soviet intervention, you wrote what happens when a party, the Communist Party, and a great power, the USSR, cease to embody revolutionary hope. One could argue they never really did, as those spooks in suits were themselves possessed by the spectre of autocracy. If the revolution was really ever revolutionary, it's thanks to Mayakovsky. You wrote the occupation of Czechoslovakia, the crushing of the guerrillas, the Chilean tragedy, and the Chinese myth. The post-1968 period is a long series of defeats. That's why it matters to find out who committed the innocence rather than the crime. In modern Ukraine, there's no room for rose-tinted revolutionary romanticism. Now, socialism is the food for worms, to be tossed overboard. Lucky for me, Bolsheviks come and go, but art remains. And more often than not in Ukraine, those heroes are accompanied by subtitles. However, instead of brat, brother, they read cat, executioner. In 1978, Andrei Tarkovsky returned to Tallinn to complete his legendary film Stalker. Having made the trip once before, but with the negative mishandled and the cinematographer fired, Andrei, on the threshold of the room, left empty-handed. It's inconceivable to shoot such a film twice, but then again, in the words of the stalker, the zone demands respect, otherwise it will punish you. Having been accused of prematurely entering into production, perhaps Andrei had inadvertently disturbed the zone, and only on condition of the script's revision and extension could he return to face the meat mincer. That same year, you returned to Japan, and in turn, our journey enters the zone. As you had in San Francisco, in Tokyo I made the pilgrimage of a film I have seen at least 20 times. Your film, Sunless. Immediately running off to see if everything is where it should be. The Ginza Owl, the Shimbashi locomotive, Gotokuji, and the Temple of the Fox. I tracked down those cemeteries in the shadow of banks, pictures bigger than people, and a city crisscrossed by trains. I make a prayer, Japanese style. Drink sake with the lost souls of Namidabashi, and spend my Sundays in Yoyogi. I take measure of the unbearable vanity of the West and make the obligatory offering to the faithful soul of Hachiko. Released in 1982, Sunless is perhaps your defining masterpiece. as this tapestry of introspection, considered one of the greatest documentaries ever made, continues to inspire every non-fiction fanatic who picks up a camera. You wrote, "I bow to the economic miracle, but what I want to show you are the neighborhood celebrations." In the smouldering light of New Year, you dusted off your Kino eye, revealing the schematic for yet another kind of filmmaking. You wrote, "When all the celebrations are over, it remains only to pick up all the accessories of the celebration, and by burning them, make a celebration." In the electronic world of the maniac, Hayao Yamaneko, you discovered your digital Dondo Yaki, known simply as the Zone, a homage to Tarkovsky. As his zone was a reserve for the immortality of faith, your zone becomes a pause button for the impermanence of things, where against the pixelated pyre of your pal's machine, images shredded in a frame of fire are returned to a sort of subconscious debris, transforming the inaccessible reality of the past into a proxy of the present. You wrote, "I think of a world where each memory could create its own legend. I think, by unplugging Hayao's electronic graffiti and hooking it up to the street, the glade of Stalker took root in the insomnia of Sunless, with your zone becoming itself a rewilding, albeit a cultural one." You wrote, "I've been round the world several times, and now only banality still interests me. Only by surrendering to the rhythm of the street could you recover your lens from the battleground of the 60s and decipher a new principle of things that quicken the heart. I was in Nara with a sacred deer. In Cheshire, I rediscovered the image Basho had written about in the 15th century. But it was in Georgia, coming back from Trousseau Valley, where I thought of Shonnegan's List and all those signs one has only to name to quicken the heart. Unlocking the realization that in nature or electronic texture, the zone itself is a metaphor for inspiration. a construct in which to decipher the indecipherable, with the stalker being that individual who adds colour to an otherwise meaningless landscape. In the words of the stalker, the zone is a complicated system of traps. Traps disappear, others appear. The right trails are blocked. The route is clear, then indecipherable again. That's the zone. It may seem capricious, but at each moment, it's what our conscience makes it. The trial of the zone extends to the edit. As clips are lifted, scrubbed and tidied up, some play where others don't take, with each cut attempting to dislodge the secret to the sequence. It's tedious work. A landscape here, a landscape there, a building in Tbilisi, one in Tokyo, a Japanese cat, a Georgian cat, a Japanese girl in Georgia. You get the idea. Eventually, I find myself focusing more on what's missing than what's there. The Monsieur Chat pillows at Incheon Airport, the rhinestone-clad crooner taking the metro, the photographer from Donetsk, her last night in Seoul, the fashion designer from Busan, my last night in Seoul, the little Russian and gypsy girls trading roses in Tbilisi. The whole sequence perfectly framed, perfectly lit, but I didn't have the heart to hit record. Somehow, in those moments that elude me, I feel you at work, pulling strings from beyond level 5. Even the cats run from me. I should take it as a compliment, perhaps, that you would sabotage my film just to stay out of sight. I welcome your challenge, but the jig is up. The cat is out of the bag. Now it's my turn, behind the camera. Attempting to recover at least a handful of images. I remember the crooner from the metro had given me a photograph and even signed it. Then there's my last night in Seoul. Looks more closed circuit than cinematic, but it'll do. As for the photographer from Donetsk, however, it's tricky. I go back to her exhibition, Memory Decay, to see what I can find. Ironically, the project is itself an attempt to recover lost images, those of a past life, destroyed by displacement from the war in Donbass. As for my portrait, trivial by comparison, I make do with a projection. That is, until we meet again, my first night in Kiev. You wrote, "The Japanese secret," what Levi Strauss had called the poignancy of things, implied the faculty of communion with things, of entering into them, of being them for a moment. Dog-tired of playing cat and mouse, I develop a game to trick the zone. I call it Guillaume caching. The rules are simple. You walk straight, only changing direction on meeting a cat, owl, or green light. As the zone lets through those who've lost all hope. If you play for long enough, you're sure to win. One night in Naha, I even hit the jackpot. It was the birthday of Silvio Moreno, an Argentinian folk singer who had come to Okinawa in 1979, fleeing persecution under the Jorge Videla military junta.
Paisaje
You wrote, Okinawa is a Japan that's kept its memory, and Naha is a city full of ghosts. Arriving prepared, determined to avoid delay. I expected at least a little resistance, but it's all here. Everything you had spoken about in level 5, surrendering itself almost immediately. Commodore Perry, still laying among the decaying tombs of the foreign graveyard. The tags, the cats and karate, exactly as you left it. Even the bulls moo high side. Making my way through the anthill, once fortified by Ushijima's high command, I'm struck by the speed in which tranquility cascades into nightmare. The air thick in the memory of bayonet drills on live prisoners, and babies silenced by so-called samurai. I must admit, losing my nerve for history, I think more about Laura than the 32nd Army. Noticing that between your trip and mine, flowers have been added among the coins and furniture arranged by Yahara to leave a good impression. I follow the trail between Sunless and Level 5 to the Himoyuri cave. You wrote, this is the ditch where 200 girls had used grenades to commit suicide in 1945 rather than fall alive into the hands of the Americans. In reach of that horror, I cross a mirage of peering faces straight out of the local museum. Thankfully, the special effects have been axed, along with the souvenir lighters. But cornering your fading memory against the cave diorama, I managed to smoke out my own open sesame. Understanding that the accumulation of things that quicken the heart is more than just a filmmaking philosophy, it's a personal prerequisite that runs from your Beaulieu into your bones, imparting a flash of harmony in which to conquer one's insignificance, at least for a moment. In Stalker, the zone leads to the room, a place which grants the innermost wish of all who enter. The interminable neon of Tokyo, however, leads to a small bar in Shinjuku. A themed tavern, more Planet Solaris than Planet Hollywood, which is itself an outpost outside of time. Rerunning your unique sensibility nearly every night, from 8 till late. I spend so much time programming the prompt to unmount your memory. The only chance I get to be myself is among those familiar faces at La Jetée. I met the whole gang, but don't worry, I didn't ask too many questions. Because curiosity killed the cat, of course. But more importantly, because I didn't need to. It was obvious. The sincerity you left behind filled the room like incense. A sincerity which dictates that with only 8 chairs, there's no room for pretenses. You wrote, to know that for almost 40 years, a group of Japanese are getting slightly drunk beneath my images. That's worth more to me than any number of Oscars. Beneath those aging images, I cross timelines to touch the threshold of the room, where you too became a stalker, navigating the indeterminable landscape of the 2 extreme poles of survival. In Sunless, you framed Japan against Bissau and Cape Verde. But in truth, the other side of survival was Russia. Stringing 8 films between those 2 poles, you'd been round the world several times, but it seems only Japan and Russia kept inviting you back. You wrote of Russian kindness and Russian curiosity, of Russian strength and Russian cruelty, where friendship can charge like a cavalry, but applaud when a writer is imprisoned. You raved about the Russian gaze and the Slavic soul, from the shores of southern Siberia to a Stolovaya in St. Petersburg. Then there was Moscow. When in Tokyo, you could get lost in the labyrinth of department stores. In Moscow, you could lose yourself in the liturgy of those churches where icons are to be seen, not only on the walls. Then there was the circus, the Bolshoi, and the Cosmos. You wrote, "The only city where one can breathe surrounded by gardens, parks, real pears, real apples, and the metro. It's a hall of mirrors." Whereas Paris had the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle, Tokyo had Godzilla. Moscow had dinosaurs inside the Kremlin. Because your Russia was not the Russia of Peter or Putin. It was that Russia of mosaics bigger than buildings, where truth was pravda and cathedrals were demolished to build swimming pools. But while you were in Paris, amidst the commotion of Christo's environmental installation, the Pont Neuf wrapped, in which, to the chagrin of Jacques Chirac, the oldest bridge in Paris was wrapped in gold fabric, things in turn were starting to wrap up for that Russia of your youth.
Even doctors who touch them, who changed their suits and give them hospital robes, even doctors, they received radiation burns on hands, even here in hospital.
In 1986, the disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was the moment that sealed the fate for your Russia. I wonder, what did the Strugatsky brothers think watching Gorbachev on TV? It's unlikely Roadside Picnic was their first thought. But 30 years later, their prophetic novel and Tarkovsky's ominous adaptation have become inseparable from the tragedy. With the police cordon, the punctured landscape and the ethereal threat, fiction corrodes into reality. Trespassers even feed the folklore between the concrete and flora by calling themselves stalkers, traversing the quietest place in the world where any deviation is dangerous, to find freedom inside the barbed wire. The only alternative is to take the official Sunday stroll. But between a hot lunch and hotspot photo ops, I can't help but wonder, would Andrei recognize his allegorical zone in this foreboding corner of Ukraine? Would his Returning Dogs inspire a sequel? Now that's a film I'd like to see. Although free from the censorship of Goskino, perhaps the greed of Hollywood would dictate a blockbuster. I can already picture the marquee. Stalker 2, Return to the Zone, in IMAX. After 20 years of sabotage, Tarkovsky ultimately defected from USSR. He, who was so profoundly and naturally Russian, would never again see the birch trees or taste the air of his childhood. As in December 1986, just months after the disaster, tragically, Andrei died from lung cancer, supposedly contracted during the filming of Stalker, becoming himself a monkey, a victim of the zone. In your tribute, One Day in the Life of Andrei Arsenovich. You revealed yourself amongst the congregation at a cathedral which bears the name of a film, St. Alexander Nevsky. Widows hide their grief behind a veil, but for the first time in 50 years, you revealed your face in a film. Maybe no one noticed, but for me, this symbolic gesture of a man most think is a cat, who always refused to be photographed, speaks to the unparalleled respect and admiration you had not only for Tarkovsky, but for the artist and the Russian. In The Owl's Legacy, your 13-part excavation of ancient Greece, you sized up all the Athenian heirlooms you could get your hands on. Philosophy and logomachy, mythology and misogyny, tragedy and democracy. You wrote, "It was in Tbilisi, in March 1988, one of the few places on earth where words had a price." Little did you know, that last Greek word, democracy, was catching fire on the other side of the wall. But before Berlin, before Prague or Timisoara, you stopped off in Moscow to bid farewell to that Russia of the last century, casting a portrait of an era through the portrait of a man. Alexander Ivanovich Medvedkin, the last Bolshevik, whose rosebud was a red flag. You wrote, so the picture book was closing, the one that had opened with the Potemkin's first dead, and whose last idols would fall that same night. We live worlds apart, even further than Medvedkin from Prince Yusupov. So much so, it's easier to imagine Flash Gordon storming the Winter Palace before these moustached men. They are relics of Planet Mongo, frayed ribbon of that picture book, long since closed. But now that I think about it, long before I saw your road in Iceland or jetty at Orly, I too was in Moscow with Ian Felix. I was taking his picture without knowing you were there the night of his hanging. Who says statues die after all? When the present is perforated by memory, not unlike the pockmarked marble of a reborn metro station, images once deemed inconsequential suddenly rush to the surface. It's these moments of harmony which put into true perspective the fragility of filmmaking. You wrote that would be the end of utopia, the very idea of utopia. The promise of the 1990s may have succeeded in flushing out Leninism, but what stood in its place was more cronyism than Cobainism. The collapse of USSR left behind an immense topography of exhausted industry, ecological distress and territorial dispute, with siblings of the Chernobyl zone reaching far beyond the Ukrainian border. Lenin's legacy is littered from the Baltic to the Bering Sea, the Carpathian Mountains to the Pamir, and back to the Caucasus. After exhausting the real world, naturally you mapped the virtual one. In Paris, the Pompidou Center has exhumed your executables, starting with Zapping Zone, proposals for an imaginary television. Gamajoba, Mr. Noah. Then the scoop of the last century, a peek behind the cat flap, a tell-all interview with your prehistoric program, Dialector. I should have known that even in code, you'd be catty. Between Sunless and Level 5, the debris of the zone dreamt up on Hayao's machine, in turn became the matrix of William Gibson's Neuromancer. On that image, you wrote, we Neanderthals graft our own vision. In Level 5, Laura makes a confidant of her computer. It doesn't dog, it doesn't sardine, nor cauliflower, but does confide in her a shortcut to total recall. Optimal World Link, the knowledge standard. Your mecha maquette for an alternative internet, where by returning the World Wide Web from plain C to the world of console cowboys, you could reboot from the innovations of Silicon Valley, that constructivist innuendo, to the equalizing force of modern technology, as once more all the culture of the past met all the impatience for the future. No longer in need of celluloid, a lab, or guillotine. With 2 paws, Photoshop, and a password, you stormed the frontier of consumer-grade computing like a kamikaze, making yourself at home in all the mischief and anonymity afforded by the vast, unconquerable landscape of the web. Is that what you meant when you wrote, "Poetry will be made by everyone, and there will be emus in the zone"? Caught between the cyberspace of OWL and the yellow tag of Monsieur Chat, you tailed the new millennium out of windows onto the rooftops of Paris. Illustrating your favorite slogan, the owl is to the cat what the angel is to the man. Under the banner of your final masterpiece, The Case of the Grinning Cat. But by lending a paw and co-opting the critter into a symbol of the present, you did more than just salute the custodians of a new culture. You threw out an answer to the question that would permeate the decade of your departure. How to find truth in the information age. You wrote, "We were the Freedom Cats." If you didn't catch the message, just move on. But whilst scaling the hideout of your 21st century cat, you lost your footing when the sound and fury of post-9/11 Paris culminated in the tragedy of Marie Trintignant and Bertrand Canton. You wrote, "A famous singer kills a famous actress. What a bounty for the scavengers." The crime of passion, however, was an assault. Not by a man madly in love, but a man madly jealous, mercilessly beating his girlfriend into a coma over a text message You did your best to pull an honest slant from the headlines. But beauty was a bit of a blind spot, and perhaps your optimism for the future got the best of you. When, by bringing together the faces of two star-crossed lovers in a flimsy moment of editing, you did about as much for Marie Trintignant as the tabloids. As for Bertrand Canton, he served just 4 years for the murder, but the curse of his black desire would continue to howl far from the hilltops of Vilnius. With the suicide of his wife, Christina Radi, further exposing the violence inseparable from his name. The investigation may have been dismissed, but the subsequent testimony of his bandmates revealed beyond any doubt a culture of abuse which they too were complicit. And so, over this quagmire, all I can do is keep a small silent place for Marie and Christina, two women sacrificed to the misogyny of a society which allows a murderer to resume a career in rock and roll. Bravo. From Paris 37 to May 68, the Takenoko Zoku to Monsieur Chat, you approached each gateway to the future by reprocessing the debris of the past, until finally putting your affairs in order with a requiem for the 20th century, the installation Owls at Noon. A reflection on that great wall, as defined by T.S. Eliot in The Hollow Men. The hollow men, the stuffed men. This is the dead land. This is Cactus Land. Then, on your 91st birthday, July 29th, 2012, you gifted yourself one last catnap at the computer and logged into level 5 forever. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Your loyal cat continues to keep watch, but things have changed since you were last active. Even your cyberpunk search engine isn't safe from the fat cats of big tech. Without thinking, I type in your name, but no, it doesn't know that either. And so, in order to perform one last dondoyaki and drop you at the platform of the new century, I take the metro to your stop, Maraîcher. How much time was spent waiting here over the years? How many imaginary movies played out in the monitors above the platform? Perhaps, as some images are meant to be kept, some are to remain memories, while others are best forgotten. Sometimes I wonder, does documentary film simply amount to a montage of moments, defenseless enough to be filmed? A suggestion of what was or what could have been? I follow the signs to your studio to honor the spirits of all those films lost to corrupt hard drives, expired reels, dead batteries, and full cassettes. To salute the cats, too crafty to be caught. The girls who jammed the camera, the frames cut in order to tidy up, and the scenes cut all together. You've stopped making dates, but hoping you'll make an exception. I try my luck, but no. Cat got your tongue. And so, this film must end where it began. How many seasons ago was that now? In Tokyo, I took my fortune and followed a labyrinth of shrines to the gates of hell, which, as it turns out, was located in the suburbs of Osaka. I played a machine to predict my fate. Naturally, I was damned. In Korea, I met Buddhists and Christians. I saw frescoes in Abkhazia and heard the call to prayer in Azerbaijan. I got creeped out by the Bone Church in Czech Republic and the Catholic Church from my childhood. I saw remnants of the Golden Rose in Lviv and the remains of Lenin in Moscow. But the only apparition I could trust were the cats of Gotokuji. From the suburbs of Tokyo to the suburbs of Paris, these ceramic cats with one paw raised have bear witness to a journey caught between two timelines and 120 years. Like little guardians over all that which has slipped away, unable to cross time's passage. The shipwrecks, the mutinies, the faces of happiness who fell overboard, the cats who walked the plank, the Salus, the Abayos, and the Paka-Pakas. All those moments of inspiration and banality, in and out of the zone. All that remains is to set free the spirits of all those who are not missing, but dead. Tora, Lulu and Ludovic, Guillaume, and my little Mayakovsky. By evoking the prayer spoken by the woman in Sunless, to say simply, Chris, wherever you are, peace be with you.